Hey, Jess, thanks for joining me and doing this today. Really appreciate it.
No problem.
So we're sitting in your house. We have your dogs all around us. And I want to talk about emotional support animals.
Definitely.
So a lot of people will not look at certain buildings because they have antiquated policies that were put in place in the 60s and 80s that didn't allow animals, didn't allow any pets. And now in today's world where pets are the new kids and everyone has them, everyone wants them, what is the way around that? What does an emotional support animal certificate do and how does it work?
Well, nowadays it's become more ubiquitous in terms of people utilizing the term animal or emotional support service animal. In theory, you don't necessarily have to have a certificate of approval through a behavioral center. What you can do is speak to a physician or a family counselor and have them create a document that describes your pet as your emotional support. It's been proven and shown through various studies in the health industry that animals are good for health. People who have animals live longer. They're less stressed, they're less anxious, they're more active, they're more physical. The activity level increases as well.
Never thought about that. That makes sense.
So just having animals around just will increase your longevity of life in itself. So not being able to have animals in a place where you're living and where you dwell is unfortunate. A lot of times it comes down to nuisances or property damage or issues of that source. But if you were able to get a documentation that said, this is my emotional support animal per HIPAA guidelines of protection for patients and their information, medical stuff, they're not allowed to divulge anything more than just, this is my emotional support animal.
Okay, so the letter doesn't have to go into details about what you have.
Exactly.
What does the letter look like? What does it sound like?
Well, there's different forms and templates of it, but essentially if you just list, this is the person, Mr. Black, and he has an emotional support animal for his underlying emotional or behavioral health issues, or you don't even have to get that specific. If you just have a letter that's documented and signed by a licensed practitioner or therapist, showing that they're licensed and insured and all that stuff, it shouldn't be an issue. They can't legally come back and say, well, what's your problem? Tell me more about that. That's none of their business.
And who typically asks for that letter? And do you have to produce it? What are the guidelines around that? And I've always heard HIPAA, but what does HIPAA stand for?
Well, HIPAA is a health insurance practice. That's what the HIP stands for. And basically it's just the rights of patients to not have their personal and health information made public. So I think the way
it's about privacy.
Yeah, it's a privacy law.
Okay.
It's a privacy act, Health Privacy Act, but basically it all stemmed from supposedly back in, the medical days. One of the practitioners who created the Hippocratic Oath created HIPAA, and he also supposedly was schizophrenic himself. And so he was, very, conscious of who knew what about him. He was always, he was kind of like a paranoid schizophrenic. So he kind of basically created HIPAA.
And he was still a practicing physician.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he was like creating this concern with people who need to know about my health concerns.
Yeah.
That's the supposed seed of how it stemmed.
And when did that happen?
A very long time ago, maybe in the early 19th century. So a long time back. But basically nowadays, usually a supervisor of a management company or a, building facility will require this form. Sometimes you can waive fees associated with animals.
I've heard that too. I've heard once you have that, you can't ask for fees. Do you know about that?
Correct. I think a lot of times they will waive the pet deposits or pet fees if it's an emotional support or a service animal.
That's been my experience too.
So a lot of people have gone that route because it's unfortunate that you're basically penalized for having an animal.
Absolutely.
It's like some people can have a million children and probably worse sometimes than the animal. But either way, there's a lot of ways around it. So sometimes if you're adopting an animal as well, like through PAWS in the city, they'll request permission from your building, basically. If there's
So Paul's will call ahead of time. Make
No,
sure.
they'll ask you for documentation. So, like when I adopted her from Paws, Resi, she was about 12 weeks old. I adopted her, and I was living in a facility, not in this home, but in a different apartment building, and they required
the Kent, right?
the Kent.
Yeah.
So they wanted to have a documentation that's like, is it okay for you to have an animal? And then I basically paid the deposit or all that stuff. So I was able to go to my building management and say, I want to adopt this animal, and have them kind of make sure I didn't get a certain breed. And, there's restrictions and things, but that goes out the window if you have an emotional support animal.
So what, if you're going to Pause, and would you want to be preemptive and go to your building and say, I have this letter from my doctor if they didn't allow them?
Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely.
And
I think being proactive and knowing that these issues might occur beforehand will make the process streamlined, because once you go somewhere and then you have your heart set on something, it'll be a letdown if the process is a little bit difficult or it doesn't happen and then it falls through, and it's just kind of not a good thing.
And will Pause accept the emotional support animal certificate if you're in a building that they know doesn't allow dogs?
You would have to get the final approval from the building. So I think you would have to show the building your emotional support documentation and have them give you a document that says you're allowed, because it's not your property.
And an emotional support animal versus a service animal. I think some people, you see those vests all the time on, they'll say service animal. I'm looking at the person, I'm like,
it's like don't touch on duty. Well, sometimes I think that's you can just get online and buy a vest of that sort.
Yeah.
People want to make it seem more than it is, especially when you're traveling. A lot of times the security, especially now with like COVID times, it's difficult. So you slap a little badge that says service dog, it's a little more official, but it's really the same thing. I mean, I think a lot of times there's actual service dogs for the blind and people who need help, who have disabilities, who have seizure disorders. Those dogs they come from facilities that they've been trained. They don't get them as puppies. It's not like that. They're specialized dogs. Those are literally service dogs.
They have them for seizures?
They have them for seizures.
Dogs can
detect seizure.
Like before it happens?
And so a lot of times if
Really?
people, so they're
Is
like
that
trained.
preempting you to take your meds or?
So sometimes people just have epileptic seizures or something where they're incapacitated, and the dogs are trained to notice the changes and they're able to detect that.
That's so cool.
Or if the person collapses or something, they know how to help, get help or bark, or they're trained
Bring
to
attention to the situation.
Yes, to do certain things and help with people with those type of disabilities. So those
That's
are
really cool.
more formal service dogs that have been trained and gone through extensive, it takes a long time for blind people and epileptic people and stuff of that nature to have these service animals. But, you look everywhere, there's like little Bijans with a service animal vest. It's like, probably not. But people do it just because it looks a little more official.
As a physician, when someone comes and asks for this, are you put off to it? Are you immediately open to it? Do you ask questions? What does the process look like?
I think in the past, because it was kind of a trending situation, it was a little bit more, this is a little like shady, or it was a little bit more daunting to do. But now it's become kind of a dime a dozen. And I honestly, in my own practice, I prescribe animals to people, especially my adolescent depressive patients or anxious patients. I always discuss with them, do you have an animal in home? Are you active? Doing any after school activities? Half the time they're not. They're just sedentary. They're at home, miserable, depressed. They have no will. That's part of the depression. And I'll say, consider adopting a dog, because
I've never thought about that as something to recommend or a diagnosis.
I've actually done it recently, the past 2 weeks, to adolescent children of mine that were 15 and 12. And one of them actually did get a dog, and the other one, they were working on it. I definitely recommend it to my patients with any of these ailments, because it's known to keep the distraction off that the person thinking about themselves. They're putting their heart and their mental state on this animal, taking care of it, responsibility. They're staying active. They're walking outside. They're, losing some weight. They're actually, they're it just changes everything.
Makes a lot of sense in the world. I mean, if you have a pet, you have to go outside. You have something to take care of. So now that gives you a little more meaning, maybe.
You're not just sitting around being miserable, you know. And it's unconditional love. And it's just been shown and proven in various studies that people who have animals are just generally healthier and they will live longer.
So what's the process like? If someone wants to get this, they just call their doctor up and ask? Is it just a normal doctor's visit?
Yeah, in my practice, I just, someone will have a cat or a dog or something and say, do you mind, my building is giving me a hard time, or my landlord's asking me for documentation. Can you please, write this for me? And I would be more than happy to write them up a letter saying my patient has this cat or this dog. It's their emotional support animal. If there's any further questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to contact me. Signed by the physician.
Okay. Are there any instances where a landlord can say no to the ESA animal or the ESA certificate?
Regarding legality in like different municipalities and cities, I'm not sure if they're able to say like, well, no, this is my property, so we don't care. But I think now things are changing and someone could turn around and be like, well, you're discriminating against me, or, so I'm assuming it's illegal to turn away that documentation.
Anything else on this topic you think is relevant?
I just think in general, dogs are, dogs in general, I have dogs, but animals, whether it's a bunny or a snake or whatever animal, I think is just a beneficial
So that's interesting.
tool.
I think of dogs and cats, of course. Mm-hmm. What other animals do people get prescribed or get these certificates for?
Well, I'm sure they can. Realistically, you can't discriminate like, oh, well, a dog and a cat.
Okay,
or
what's the
my
difference?
bunny isn't considered, I think any sort of animal, a bird, snake, fish. At this point, I don't think there's anything that's not a living creature that you can't say would be an emotional support. Maybe you feel less anxious and less depressed when you look at your fish tank or when you feed your fish or whatever,
And no one can make that assessment.
Yeah, who are you to say like, well, that doesn't count because it doesn't bark or lick you or, who cares?
Thank you so much for doing this.
You're welcome.
Really appreciate it. I think everyone will really enjoy it. And this is always a topic that comes up and so many people don't know. And because I work in the industry, you hear it all the time and you're just thinking like, oh, of course, you can just get an ESA animal. But like in the building I live in, no pets are allowed. Mm-hmm. But there's pets and people are always wondering, well, how and why? And especially people of older generations, they get upset because they moved into this building to be away from animals.
Yeah.
And now there's becoming this conflict between the older and newer residents who are upset with the animals. And it's unfortunate, but everyone should have the right to have a pet.
Exactly.
That's what I think.
As long as it's not impeding on someone else's life or their situation. As long as your dog isn't going and pissing on the neighbor's door or chewing on.
In a lot of buildings, they have specific elevators or they have protocols, and it's like, okay, you have your animal, that's fine. Yeah,
stuff like that. Yeah, you don't want Cujo creating chaos in your dwelling, but if you keep your animal, safe and secure in the way that you're supposed to, then it shouldn't be an issue.
Anything else you can think of?
Definitely yay to dogs.
Yay
to dogs. And also adopting is a really big thing because obviously we have a big pet problem where people are just, the designer dogs, the puppy mills and things of that nature. So definitely adoption is a good idea. Here come the psychopaths. But yeah, otherwise adopted, very loving, very friendly. It's always a good option.
Let's leave on that. That was perfect.
That was perfect.
Okay, thanks again.
You're welcome.
Bye.